Bom dia, buenos dias, good morning. My name is Steve Niemi, and I've been invited to present an overview and some comments on an exciting new lab animal journal project that's being organized by Dr. Marcel Freiblot in Rio de Janeiro. Marcel had reached out to me because of my experience in management and because of my experience with some laboratory animal colleagues in Latin America. And I was delighted to uh, to take his request and accept his invitation. My comments will be presented in these following slides, and we can get started. I think this is an opportunity for a new lab animal journal that will be better than the other ones, and in that regard, even smarter and a benefit to all of us. First, I want to cover my usual disclaimers. Any opinions or anything that I say today belong to me only, and so nobody else is to blame if anybody gets mad. And I have no conflicts of interest to declare with either commercial or financial relationships. If I mention any companies, they are only for example purposes and is not an endorsement of their products or services. What I want to discuss today is on this list, just to familiarize you with my Latin American experiences. Then I want to review the other lab animal journals that are currently on the market, so we can talk about the competition, and then compare that to what I hope will be some features of BMRT and how that journal can be different from all the others, and finally why that's important and how that can help make this field better. Many years ago, I worked at the Massachusetts General Hospital, where I was director of the Center for Comparative Medicine. And around 2009, I was attending a meeting with the America's Regional Committee of ICLAS, the International Council for Laboratory Animal Science. And we talked about the need to expose more lab animal senior people in Latin America to management of laboratory animal care and to managing vivaria and how that might best be accomplished. So we organized a new fellowship program in lab animal science and management that we carried for a couple of years, where we would pay for the travel and for the room and board for 2 to 3 months for people who were selected by ICLAS as good nominees. It was a wonderful experience. Here is a list of the people that we hosted, and we learned as much, if not more, from them than they learned from us. Most of these people are veterinarians, but not all, and I think it was a very successful program. Since that time, I've been invited to speak in Chile and Brazil on several occasions and enjoyed those experiences very much too. Now let's look at the competition and why do we need another journal. Here are the covers of the usual players, some from the US, some from the UK, some from China, some from India, one from Europe, and there's even a Scandinavian Journal of Laboratory Animal Science. So what are all of these offering that create the need for a different approach? Well, first of all, none of these journals will publish negative results. And that's true of scientific journals in general. If you haven't found anything that is different or new, then it's unlikely that your paper is going to be published. The problem with that is if nobody else knows if the experiment you ran failed, they're likely to run it themselves. And so you have more animals being used and more time and money being consumed. And if they get a negative result as well, maybe they would have learned from you and not have to run the experiment anyway. Another big problem that has come to light over the last 7 or 8 years, not only in life sciences and lab animal science, but in pretty much every field of science, is reproducibility. When people try to run experiments that have been published, it is unfortunate that too often they don't get the same results that were in the original paper. And why is that? There was a major paper in Nature by Begley and Ellis in 2012 that looked to replicate what were known as important or landmark oncology studies in animals published by academic labs over a 10-year period, and only 6 of 53 or 11% of those studies gave the same results when those studies were performed by Amgen scientists, a biotech company in the US. And this is a major problem for a number of reasons, but specifically if the pharmaceutical and the biotechnology industries want to use studies that have been published in academia, but can't get the same results. And if it's only 11% of those studies that are reliable, we have a major problem. And so in a follow-up paper, Begley explained what those problems were in the papers that they could not reproduce. And so he comes up with what are known as 6 red flags for experimental design. What they discovered was the experimental design was the problem in almost all of these cases, and it wasn't a situation where people were intentionally fabricating the data or not being honest. But still, there were some very simple things that we all learned early in our scientific careers that had not been followed, and they're listed here. In many cases, the studies weren't blinded so that the observer knew in advance which animals might be treated or be treated at different doses than others. In some cases, not all the results were shown, just the ones that were most favorable to the conclusions reached, while other results that might be less favorable or actually contradictory were omitted. Did the authors in that paper repeat the studies, or did they only do it once? And if they repeated it, did they find the same results that they found in the first trial? And in many cases, this was not done. Did you have positive controls and did you have negative controls in your paper? And if you did, were the results from those groups also included? And in many cases, they weren't. For the reagents that we're using, including the animals, were they validated? Were they shown to be consistent? Were they shown to be pure? Were they shown to function or perform the same from batch to batch? And finally, were the statistical tests appropriate? Did you use statistics that would be objective, or did you choose statistical tests or not know that the statistical tests you were using might favor your outcome rather than be truly scientific and neutral? And there's another flag that Begley did not include, but I think is important, and that is, did you randomize your animals to your test groups? Or did you put all the bigger ones in one group and all the smaller ones in another group? Even if you didn't want to, we often find bias, unintended bias, in performing these studies. So randomizing the animals to test groups, including your controls, is also a very simple, yet a very important experimental design component that needs to be done. To my knowledge, none of those journals that I listed will insist on all of these 6 or 7 red flags being followed. So in addition to negative results missing and data not being reproducible because the study designs were flawed, What else is missing from all of those journals in the lab animal field? Rarely do we see studies that talk about the financial impact of those conclusions, or do we see papers that are devoted to financial management at all, which is a very important part of running a successful vivarium. What about worker safety? Even though a protocol may be approved by a safety committee, does that mean that the workers were as safe as possible? And how did the workers feel about being a part of that study if there was a biohazard, a chemical hazard, a fire hazard, or any other kind of risk that was involved? None of these papers as well offer a bulletin board or a chat room for community discussion for each of those papers that would be published and available after the paper is in press, and could be a very interesting way to compare notes between the authors and other people who may want to explore or use the discoveries that were made in that paper. We also rarely see commentary, opinion pieces, essays uh, about the lab animal field. It might be lab animal ethics, it might be lab animal medicine, it might be lab animal policy. Most of these journals are devoted only to research publications and don't allow for any other types of papers. Another thing that's missing that may or may not be related to these journals, but is still a big vacuum in our field, is multi-program collaborations. So if there is a large project that needs attention and it's too expensive or too big for one program or one institution to perform, uh, this is like a clinical trial. Why cannot there be multiple site experiments all run by a group of people at the same time, who then compile all of the data later and publish that as a group effort? And then finally, most, if not all of these journals are really not available to the public, either because they have too much scientific jargon or they're too expensive. And that's, to me, unfortunate, because the public is very curious and sometimes very concerned about animal research. And the more information they have and the more effort we undertake to educate them and include them in the conversation, that can only help us. This is not to say we're going to change anybody's mind who is an activist and is totally against animal research, but they have a voice too. And as long as they talk about what goes on and we don't share with the public what actually goes on, they still have an advantage in gaining the public's opinion, while we remain too silent or too removed. So let's start with the minimum requirements for this new journal. Any papers that are published in a research mode must follow the scientific method. So this is something we all appreciate. There will be an introduction and explain the current knowledge of the field and what's missing. And so that's the basis of these new experiments. There would be a hypothesis, there will be materials and methods, there will be the results presented and the statistical analyses of those results, followed by conclusions and discussion. Those conclusions must be evidence-based or data-driven, so it's not just merely opinion from this research, but have a firm basis for those conclusions. Any manuscripts, whether they be research papers or commentaries, should be peer-reviewed so that others who are familiar with the science and the medicine and the husbandry in this field can advise the editors if this is a good paper, if it is well written, does it follow those 6 or 7 flags of concern, and other details. And you don't need a print version these days. You can avoid all that expense with just digital distribution. And at the bottom of my list is just a possibility, but not a requirement. Uh, should there be an English language version too, or should there be English translations available through Google or other translation engines so that you can reach a wider audience? With all of that as the basics, how can BMRT be better than what's available to us today? For negative results, encourage all studies to be published. If the scientific basis and the experimental design is good, but the results are poor, that should not disqualify this paper from being in the journal. In terms of data reproducibility, again, going back to Begley's 6 flags of bad experimental design and my 7th about randomizing animals, BMRT could be the first journal in this field to insist on good study design, which is just basic science, but as we all know, is too often ignored. About the financial impact, in addition to inviting management of finance people to submit manuscripts, also encourage alternatives to US standards, which are usually engineering standards and usually expensive, and in many cases, not worth the cost. So BMRT could be a leader in alternatives to what are in the US and in the EU and in the UK that may not justify the expense. And in this case, I want to talk about engineering versus performance standards. This is standard language in the US and maybe in Latin America. Engineering standards are input driven and have no flexibility. So how big must a cage be? Or how warm or cool must a room be? Or how much must an animal weigh before it is too big for a cage? These are very popular because they're easy to measure. And so they have been in the dominant mentality in the US for 40 or 50 years. By contrast, performance standards are outcome driven. What are you trying to achieve and how can you achieve it? They are adaptable to local circumstances. You may have a strain of mouse or a species of monkey or an experimental protocol that would benefit from something different than an engineering standard. And if the animal's welfare is protected and the science is still reliable, then why not? These also need to be evidence-based, so it can't just be an opinion. So you need to measure how that animal is doing or how well that science is performed. The difference here is you have to think about what to do, and you just can't revert to a rule book. I'll give you an example. From in the US, the dominant publication we use, the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, put out by the National Research Council at the National Academy of Sciences. On page 70, if we want to know how often we need to change a rodent cage when it's dirty, this statement says enclosures, which are cages, and accessories such as tops should be sanitized at least once every 2 weeks. Solid bottom caging, bottles, and sipper tubes usually require sanitation at least once a week. And if you have ventilated rodent cages, they will allow you to carry that out to 2 weeks, but it's 2 weeks, nothing more. By contrast, on the preceding page, this statement, the frequency and intensity of cleaning and disinfection should depend on what is necessary to provide a healthy environment for an animal. It doesn't say 10 days, it doesn't say 3 months. There's no calendar here that's involved. And then on the same page as the engineering standard, there is also this statement: there is no absolute minimal frequency of bedding changes. which is in direct conflict to the sanitized at least every 2 weeks. So even within the US, we have conflict and we have choices, and people can choose which way they want to go. Let's look at some other elements about how your new journal could be better than all the rest. For worker safety impact of research papers, ask for papers not only from safety experts, but from vivarium workers on how they may have a safety concern or a safety problem and what they did to make it better. For community discussion, provide a bulletin board right next to each paper where people can post their questions or their comments. Those postings cannot be anonymous. You have to identify yourself, and those postings need to be screened by some editorial review board before they are posted. So you have people who are both responsible and knowledgeable posting those questions or comments. When it comes to essays and book reviews and commentaries, those can be included as well, from scientists, from veterinarians, from regulators, even from activists, provided that they're responsible and that they behave. Their voice needs to be included as well. For multi-program collaborations, encourage multi-site studies. This reminds me of when we launched the Zebrafish Husbandry Association when I was back at Massachusetts General Hospital around 2007 or 2008. The reason this organization came together is because all the zebrafish facilities in the Boston area had their own protocols for essentially doing the same thing, but they had no way of testing alternative approaches for husbandry because they didn't have the space or they didn't have the time or the money. And so the Zebrafish Husbandry Association was created specifically to address that void and to provide a platform where different programs and different zebrafish facilities could run some new experiments that would compare old and new ways of doing things. And then finally, for public involvement, if this is a digital journal, try and find a way to make it affordable to the public, not only for educating the public, but this is a great way to educate students about the lab animal field. It's a great way to include policymakers and regulators in this discussion, and also politicians, because for better or worse, they can have a big impact, good or bad, on how lab animal science, how lab animal care is regulated too. So I'll finish up with why this is important, and I hope I've made that obvious by now. None of the competition are doing what I call anything beyond the old way. Yet there are so many new things that need to be included in all of those journals which aren't being included. And so BMRT can not only be a service to Latin America, but could be a world leader in how lab animal science and lab animal care and lab animal medicine and lab animal policy can all become more transparent, more inclusive, and that can only make things better for the animals, for the scientists, and for the patients that are waiting for discoveries from these studies. So I wish you all good luck and look forward to seeing how this project grows. Those are the end of my comments, and now I'll turn it over to Marcel for discussion. Thank you.